The sound that finally ended the whole thing wasn't a lawsuit. It wasn't an angry argument, and it definitely wasn't one of those dramatic courtroom moments people always imagine. It was the sound of a luxury SUV smashing into 6 steel posts that had been sitting in plain sight for over an hour. The crash happened at exactly 8:47 on a Tuesday morning, and even now, every time I watch the security footage, I still find myself shaking my head because the entire mess could have been avoided if one person had simply walked an extra few steps to her mailbox. My name is Daniel Mercer. I'm 44 years old, a retired Army Staff Sergeant, and I live in a quiet neighborhood outside Frisco, Texas. At least it used to be quiet. I bought my house almost 15 years ago after my second deployment overseas. It's nothing fancy, just a single-story brick ranch built back in the 70s with a cracked driveway, an old oak tree in the front yard, and enough memories packed into those walls to fill several lifetimes. After I left the military, I wanted peace more than anything. I wanted mornings where the loudest thing I heard was my neighbor mowing his lawn. I wanted evenings where I could sit on my porch with a glass of iced tea and watch the sun go down without somebody trying to prove they were more important than everyone else. For a long time, that's exactly what I had. Then the Holloways moved in next door. Now, I should probably be fair here. When I first met Victoria Holloway, I didn't dislike her. In fact, I actually carried 2 boxes into her garage on moving day. She smiled, thanked me, and told me how excited they were to join the neighborhood. Her husband, Grant, was a partner at a high-powered law firm in Dallas. They had money, lots of it. Within 6 months, they had demolished the old house next door and replaced it with a giant modern mansion that looked like it belonged in a luxury real estate magazine instead of our modest neighborhood. The place had stone columns, oversized windows, a circular driveway, and a garage big enough to park half the vehicles in the subdivision. Nobody minded at first. People can spend their money however they want. The problem started when Victoria began acting like owning the biggest house somehow made her the mayor of the entire block. It was always little things in the beginning. Complaining about where people parked, telling kids not to ride bikes near a lawn, calling the HOA over trash cans left out a few hours too long. Most of us rolled our eyes and moved on. Then one morning, I walked outside to leave for a physical therapy appointment and found a white Range Rover parked directly across the mouth of my driveway. Not partially, not accidentally, completely blocking it. I checked the time. 8:15 a.m. I knocked on Victoria's door. She answered holding a coffee mug. "Morning," I said. "Any chance you could move your SUV? I've got an appointment." She glanced past me toward the driveway and shrugged. "I'll be out in a minute." It wasn't worth arguing. 5 minutes later, she moved it. Problem solved, or so I thought. The next morning, it happened again. Then the next morning. Then the one after that. By the end of the first week, I started noticing a pattern. Every day at almost the exact same time, Victoria would pull her SUV out of her massive garage and leave it across my driveway while she checked her mail, took phone calls, or wandered back inside her house. The ridiculous part was that her mailbox sat maybe 40 feet from her garage. 40 feet. Most people walk farther than that getting groceries from their trunk. One morning, I tried being polite. "Victoria," I said, keeping my voice calm, "would you mind not parking there anymore? It makes it hard for me to get out." She smiled the kind of smile people use when they're pretending to be nice. "Daniel, it's a public street. Nobody owns the curb." I remember standing there thinking that wasn't even the point. She wasn't using the curb. She was blocking the entrance to my property. Still, I let it go. A few days later, I brought it up again. Her answer got shorter. A week after that, she didn't even bother hiding the irritation in her voice. "You worry too much," she said. "It's only a few minutes." The funny thing about people who say it's only a few minutes is they're never talking about their own minutes. Over the next month, those few minutes became part of my daily routine. Every morning, I would look outside and wonder if my driveway was going to be usable. Every morning, I'd feel that little knot form in my stomach. Veterans spend years learning discipline, patience, and self-control because losing your temper usually makes problems worse. So I stayed calm. I documented everything. Dates, times, photos, video clips. I wasn't planning revenge. I was trying to understand why somebody with a 4-car garage felt entitled to use my property access point like her personal parking space. Then on day 36, the situation changed completely. I opened my mailbox and found a certified letter from a law office in Dallas. Grant Holloway's law office. Inside was 3 pages of legal threats accusing me of harassment, intimidation, and creating a hostile environment for his wife. I read the whole thing twice, then laughed so hard I nearly spilled coffee on the kitchen counter. The man whose wife blocked my driveway nearly every morning was threatening me with legal action for asking her to stop. That was the moment I realized this wasn't about convenience anymore. It wasn't about parking. It wasn't even about the driveway. It was about power. Victoria honestly believed nobody would challenge her because her husband was an attorney, and Grant clearly believed a law firm's letterhead could scare people into submission. What neither of them understood was that after 10 years in the Army, intimidation wasn't something that impressed me very much. In fact, their letter ended up giving me the motivation to start asking questions I probably should have asked weeks earlier. And 3 days later, sitting in a county records office staring at a property map that hadn't been updated since the 1970s, I found the first clue that would eventually bring their entire strategy crashing down. And 3 days later, sitting in a county records office staring at a property map that hadn't been updated since the 1970s, I found the first clue that would eventually bring their entire strategy crashing down. At first, it didn't look like much. Just a faded survey drawing with measurements scribbled along the edges and notes from a long-retired county engineer. Most people would have glanced at it for 10 seconds and moved on. But military service teaches you something valuable about details. Sometimes the smallest detail is the difference between a normal day and a disaster. I took copies home and spent that evening comparing the map to my property. Then I compared it again. Then one more time. Something wasn't lining up. The next morning, I called a licensed survey company and scheduled a full property survey. The cost wasn't cheap, $685. A few friends told me I was wasting money. One neighbor laughed and said, "Danny, just call a tow truck." But by then, I wasn't interested in temporary solutions. I wanted facts. I want to know exactly where my rights began and ended. The survey crew arrived 2 weeks later carrying tripods, measuring equipment, and enough orange flags to make my front yard look like a construction zone. Victoria watched the entire thing from her porch. I could practically feel her curiosity from across the property line. Around lunchtime, she finally walked over. "What's all this?" she asked. I smiled. "Just checking some property records." She folded her arms. "Why?" "Because I like knowing where my land is." She stared at me for a second, clearly expecting more information. When she didn't get any, she turned around and walked away. The survey results arrived 8 days later, and that was when everything changed. According to the official measurements, my driveway apron extended 18 inches beyond what everyone assumed was the property boundary. 18 inches doesn't sound like much until you realize those 18 inches were exactly where Victoria parked every single morning. I called the surveyor to confirm. Then I called the county permitting office. Then I paid for a consultation with a real estate attorney who specialized in property disputes. I wasn't looking for loopholes. I wasn't trying to trap anyone. I simply wanted to know what was legal. By the end of that week, I had my answer. The concrete section Victoria routinely blocked was legally part of my property access area. More importantly, I had the right to install protective barriers as long as they complied with county regulations and setback requirements. The attorney leaned back in his chair and said something I'll never forget. "Mr. Mercer, the law doesn't require you to make bad decisions for someone else's convenience." I drove home smiling, not because I was planning revenge, but because for the first time in months, I knew exactly where I stood. Over the next several weeks, I gathered permits, reviewed engineering specifications, and hired a contractor recommended by the county. Everything was documented. Everything was approved. Every signature was collected. Every requirement was met. Meanwhile, Victoria continued her routine like nothing had changed. Some mornings she'd wave at me while blocking the driveway. Other mornings, she'd ignore me completely. Once I overheard her telling another neighbor that I was being dramatic. Another time I heard her joking that veterans always think everything is a battlefield. The comments didn't bother me nearly as much as they probably should have. Mostly because I already knew something she didn't. Around day 75, Grant appeared in my driveway while I was washing my truck. He stood there in an expensive suit holding a phone and wearing the kind of confident smile attorneys seem to practice in mirrors. "Daniel," he said, "I hear you've been spending money on surveys." "Sure have. You know this is all unnecessary." "Maybe." He nodded toward my house. "You seem like a reasonable guy. I'd hate to see things escalate." There was that word again. Escalate. People like Grant loved using language that sounded friendly while carrying an entirely different message underneath. I dried my hands with a towel and looked him straight in the eye. "Funny thing about escalation," I said. "It usually starts when people refuse simple requests." His smile disappeared for about half a second. Then it returned. "Have a good day, Daniel." "You too, Grant." He walked away, believing he still controlled the situation. Looking back, that might have been my favorite part of the whole story. Not the crash, not the settlement, just that moment. Because confidence built on assumptions has a very short shelf life. Day 89 arrived on a cool Tuesday morning. My alarm went off at 4:45 a.m. I was already awake. The contractor's crew pulled in at 5:20. 3 trucks, 6 workers, 1 foreman. They unloaded equipment under portable floodlights while the neighborhood slept. By 5:45, they were drilling into the concrete. By 6:30, steel cylinders were standing upright in fresh concrete foundations. By 7:15, the installation was nearly complete. 6 steel bollards, 4 inches thick, powder-coated safety yellow, buried 3 feet into reinforced concrete footings, built to stop vehicles much larger than a luxury SUV. At 7:45, the crew packed up and left. I stood there holding a coffee mug, looking at 6 bright yellow posts lined perfectly across the edge of my property access area. They weren't hidden. They weren't camouflaged. They weren't traps. Anyone with functioning eyesight could see them from half a block away. At 8:12, Victoria's garage door opened. Right on schedule. I watched through my front window. The Range Rover rolled out. She stopped briefly near her mailbox, then drove away. For a moment, I wondered if maybe she had finally noticed the bollards and decided to change her habits. Then I remembered who we were dealing with. At 8:46, my Ring camera recorded her returning from a quick errand. The footage is almost surreal. The morning sun is shining. Birds are chirping. Everything looks peaceful. Her SUV turns the corner and approaches at maybe 12 miles per hour. Nothing dangerous. Nothing reckless. Then one detail changes everything. Her head tilts downward, just for a second. Maybe she was checking a text. Maybe she was looking at navigation. Maybe she was distracted by something on her screen. Whatever the reason, she wasn't looking where she was going. The next 2 seconds happened faster than anyone could react. The front bumper struck the first bollard with a metallic impact, so loud my camera and microphone distorted. The vehicle lurched sideways. The grille shattered. Plastic exploded across the driveway. Coolant poured onto the concrete. Steam erupted from beneath the hood. The SUV stopped instantly. The bollards didn't move at all. Not an inch. Not a fraction of an inch. Just silence. Then the driver's door flew open. Victoria stepped out screaming. Her face was bright red. Her hand was shaking. She looked from the wrecked front end of her vehicle to the bollards and back again, as if reality itself had personally betrayed her. "What is this?" she shouted. "Are you out of your mind?" I walked outside carrying a folder. Not because I had planned some dramatic movie scene, but because I knew exactly what was about to happen next. Right on cue, Grant came running across their lawn. He took one look at the damaged SUV and immediately started yelling. Lawsuit, negligence, dangerous obstruction, property damage. The words came flying out so fast he barely stopped to breathe. Then he demanded an explanation. I handed him the folder. "What's this?" he snapped. "Documentation." He opened it. First page, property survey. Second page, county permits. Third page, installation approuvée. Fourth page, contractor certifications. Fifth page, attorney opinion letter. I watched him read. Then I watched something fascinating happen. The anger drained from his face. Not all at once. Slowly, like air leaking from a tire. He turned another page. Then another. Victoria kept talking, kept yelling, kept demanding answers. Grant wasn't listening anymore. He was staring at paperwork, and for the first time since I'd met him, He looked worried, really worried. The kind of worried that happens when a lawyer suddenly realizes the facts are standing on the wrong side of his argument. And as Victoria continued shouting about lawsuits and compensation and how she was going to make me pay for every dollar of damage, Grant finally lowered the folder, looked directly at her, and said 4 words that changed the entire direction of the fight. "Victoria, stop talking. Now." And as Victoria continued shouting about lawsuits and compensation and how she was going to make me pay for every dollar of damage, Grant finally lowered the folder, looked directly at her, and said 4 words that changed the entire direction of the fight. "Victoria, stop talking. Now." The silence that followed was almost louder than the crash itself. Victoria looked stunned, not because of the damaged SUV, not because of the bollards, because her husband, the man who always had an answer, suddenly didn't. Grant stood there staring at the paperwork while steam drifted out from under the hood of the Range Rover. For a few seconds, nobody moved. Then he handed the folder back to me and quietly asked, "You had all this approved?" "Every page," I said. He nodded once. No argument, no threat, no lecture, just a nod. That's when I knew the fight was basically over. The only thing left was deciding how expensive it was going to be. 2 days later, I got a phone call from their insurance company. The adjuster sounded confident at first. They wanted my statement. They wanted photographs. They wanted to understand why fixed steel barriers had been installed where the accident occurred. I politely sent them everything. The survey, the permits, the contractor documents, the attorney consultation records. Most importantly, I sent the ring footage. There is something beautiful about video evidence. It doesn't get emotional. It doesn't exaggerate. It doesn't care who has the bigger house or the more expensive lawyer. It simply shows what happened. 48 hours later, the adjuster called back. His tone had completely changed. Victoria's claim was denied. According to their findings, the driver had collided with a clearly visible legal structure located entirely within approved property boundaries. End of discussion. I thanked him and hung up. That evening, I sat on my back patio watching the sunset and thinking about how strange the whole situation had become. 3 months earlier, all I wanted was access to my own driveway. Now there were attorneys, insurance investigators, engineering reports, and a luxury SUV sitting in a repair shop. The next step surprised a lot of people, including my friends, including my neighbors, maybe even including Grant, because I wasn't finished. Over the previous 90 days, I had accumulated real costs: survey expenses, legal consultation fees, permit processing charges, installation costs, documentation fees, time away from work. None of that existed before Victoria decided her convenience mattered more than someone else's property rights. So on day 95, I mailed a detailed, itemized demand package. Every dollar documented. Every receipt attached. The total came to $28,400. When the package arrived, word traveled through the neighborhood faster than a grass fire. One neighbor nearly choked laughing when he heard the amount. Another asked if I actually expected them to pay it. The truth was I didn't know. What I did know was that for months they had treated every polite request like a joke. Now the joke had an invoice attached to it. About a week later, I received a call from a law office I didn't recognize. It wasn't Grant. It couldn't be Grant. His earlier threat letters had created a conflict that made direct representation extremely complicated. Instead, Victoria had hired outside counsel. The attorney sounded professional, courteous, experienced. He asked whether I would be open to discussing settlement options. I listened carefully. Then I asked a simple question. Did your client ever apologize? There was a pause. We're focused on resolving the financial dispute. That's not what I asked. Another pause. Longer this time. Finally, he admitted no apology had been offered. I thanked him for his time and ended the call. Maybe some people would have negotiated right then. Maybe they would have accepted less money just to move on. I don't judge them. Everyone handles conflict differently. But there was something bigger involved here than dollars. For nearly 3 months, every attempt at a reasonable conversation had been dismissed. Every effort at compromise had been met with arrogance. Every request had been answered with entitlement. At some point, consequences stopped being punishment and started becoming education. Negotiations dragged on for several more weeks. Eventually, reality caught up with everyone involved. The evidence was overwhelming. The paperwork was airtight. The video was impossible to explain away. On day 126, a settlement agreement was finalized. The financial amount was paid over an extended schedule. A recorded access agreement was filed with the county. The bollards remained permanently in place. Future violations carried substantial penalties. Towing authorization was included. Everything was legal. Everything was enforceable. Everything was signed. The day the paperwork became official, I drove past the county office and felt something I honestly hadn't expected. Relief. Not victory. Relief. Because winning isn't always satisfying. Sometimes you're just grateful the problem is finally over. These days, life is quiet again. The oak tree still shades my front yard. My old pickup still leaks a little oil on the driveway. The neighborhood kids still ride bikes down the street. And Victoria, well, she still lives next door. We don't talk much. We don't need to. Every morning her garage door opens. Every morning she parks in her own driveway. Every morning she walks the extra distance to a mailbox. Funny how 40 feet suddenly became manageable. The 6 yellow bollards are still there too, bright as ever. Some visitors ask why I keep them. Some assume I'm making a statement. Honestly, they're just doing the job they were installed to do. Nothing more, nothing less. Every now and then somebody new moves into the neighborhood and hears part of the story. Usually the version involving the crash. That's the exciting part people remember. But if you ask me, the crash was never the real lesson. The real lesson happened long before that. It happened the first time someone decided that another person's boundaries didn't matter. It happened when simple courtesy was mistaken for weakness. It happened when power was confused with permission. And maybe that's why this story still gets people arguing whenever it comes up. Some say I should have let it go. Some say I should have accepted the inconvenience. Some think the settlement was too much. Others think it wasn't enough. Personally, I think respect is a lot cheaper than litigation. But that's just me. So now I'm curious what you think. If someone blocked your driveway nearly every day for 3 straight months, ignored every polite request, sent legal threats instead of solutions, and then crashed into a structure that was completely legal and clearly visible, where do you think the line between accountability and revenge really is? Let me know in the comments, because I have a feeling people are going to be debating that one for a long time.